Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to WAPP Spring Research Seminar Series on Make Work Fair. My name is Anisha Sindhi, and I am the Director of Research and Programs at WAPP, where our mission is to empower leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based research that advances women and gender equity. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Shiya Wang, presenting her research paper on Setting Up the Gap, Gender Differences in Initial Salary Offers in Hiring. Shiya is a WAPP Research Fellow studying how and why gender differences in earnings and career trajectories arise, as well as interventions that could mitigate these inequalities. Her current research focuses on the hiring process as a critical site for the production and reproduction of the gender wage gap. A few logistics before I hand it off to Shiya. Thank you so much for joining us today. Shiya will present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have the rest of the time for questions from our audience. Shiya has also kindly agreed to take any clarifying questions throughout her talk. So if you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A function in the chat. Siri Chalazi, who is our WAPP senior researcher and co-author of the book Make Work Fair, will be moderating the Q&A today. So feel free to let us know if you have any questions throughout. Thank you all for joining us today. Our talk will be recorded and we will share it via our YouTube as well. But thank you so much, Shiya, for being here and sharing your important and impactful research with us. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anisha, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm Shiya Wang. It is my absolute pleasure to be here as part of the Make Work Fair seminar series. I'm very excited to be presenting a paper on the ways that hiring, and specifically the initial salary offers extended by employers, can contribute to the gender wage gap. And this is joint work with my amazing co-author, mentor, graduate school advisor, Professor Adina Sterling at Columbia Business School, who has been instrumental in every single stage of this project. So the gender wage gap is persistent and widespread. In the US, women earn 83 cents for every dollar earned by men. So as we can see here using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the long-term trend has been a substantial reduction of the gender wage gap, but it has plateaued in the recent decade. What scholars have also found is that the gender wage gap is not localized to a given job or occupation. Again, we have data here showing that on average, men earn more than women in every occupation. Given the persistence of the gender wage gap, researchers and practitioners have tried for decades to understand its origin. One of the primary explanations focuses on supply-side negotiation behavior. Specifically, this literature suggests that women negotiate less frequently and less successfully than men. So this research has spurred a substantial academic literature examining why this is the case and the factors that may influence women's negotiation abilities and decisions. And as a result, practitioners frequently emphasize the importance of negotiation, and numerous programs and initiatives have been designed to enhance women's negotiation abilities. And this emphasis on the importance of negotiation and these initiatives have appeared to yield positive results. Recent research by Cray and colleagues suggests that the current state of negotiation literature may have even underestimated the likelihood and success of women's negotiation behaviors. They found that, contrary to common belief, women actually report negotiating their salaries more frequently than men. While this is encouraging news, it also raises questions about the implications for the gender wage gap. As we can see here, even if Robert and Rachel both negotiate a 10% increase, as indicated by the small blue and red bars on top of the bigger bars, Rachel's starting salary can still lag behind Robert's if she's negotiating from a lower initial offer. So in other words, even if negotiation behavior is held constant between men and women, the gender wage gap could still persist because women are given a lower starting point from which to negotiate. So to examine this potential explanation for the gender wage gap, we focus on initial salary offers from employers. And to the best of our knowledge, there has been no wide-scale study of offers to date. All studies on the gender wage gap have only investigated salaries and wages. And we think this is an important omission in the literature because studies of wages confound an understanding of the origin of the gender wage gap. Are women negotiating less favorable terms, or are women given a lower initial offer upon which to negotiate? And one reason for this omission is data availability. Obtaining offer data requires collecting earlier data than offer acceptance, which has been very difficult to do. So we, in this paper, try to address this empirical challenge by acquiring a large proprietary data set on offers from a compensation platform. And using this data set, we try to answer two research questions. Is there a gender gap in initial offers from employers? And if so, how does the size of the initial offer gap vary across occupations? To make our terminology clear, we outline here the hiring process that scholars have in mind when they talk about the effect of a negotiation on salaries. So the hiring process here includes the recruitment and screening stage prior to candidates receive an offer, and the offer extension as the decision to hire, negotiation period, and offer finalization, after which offer becomes the starting salary. The key component we want to focus here is the initial salary offers, and this is different from starting salaries. So initial offers are what employers extend to candidates after an affirmative hiring decision has been made, and offers serve as the basis for offer negotiation. So in addition to allowing us to better understand the gender wage gap, a study of offers is also important for at least two reasons. First, the negotiation studies have demonstrated that initial offers have a greater impact on final negotiation outcomes on any subsequent negotiation behavior. However, in the hiring context, we have very little knowledge about the offers men and women receive from employers and how these offers might differ. And second, initial offers establish the baseline for future wage increases, creating path dependencies for individuals' earnings throughout their tenure, either with the same employer or when they switch jobs and move to a different employer. Any gap in the initial offers could be amplified by ongoing organizational processes such as negotiation, annual raises, or promotion, and this can result in a widening gender wage gap over time. While there has not been any studies on offers, we have some evidence from consumer markets that suggest that prices offered to actors may vary depending on their demographic characteristics. So for example, researchers have found that in audit studies that white buyers at car dealership are offered lower, more favorable initial prices for cars than black buyers. Similarly, in a study of eBay auctions, researchers have found that women receive lower prices for identical goods they sell compared to men. And these findings in consumer markets suggest the possibility that women and men might receive different initial offers, also in the context of hiring. But why might initial offers vary even after accounting for occupations and jobs? We argue that there are at least two reasons. And these two reasons are both rooted in theories of cultural beliefs. So cultural beliefs are widely held expectations that people who belong to one social group are more esteemed and competent than those who belong to another social group. These beliefs shape our perceptions of others in gendered ways. So for example, men are often perceived as having higher status than women in Western societies. And these cultural beliefs can also give rise to stereotypes, which often depict men as possessing competency, agency, authority, and decision-making power. As a result, studies have found that women's skills are devalued compared to men's. Now, in the context of hiring, because individual skills and competency are often highly uncertain at the point of hire, we expect these cultural beliefs to be particularly prevalent and influential. Even for candidates deemed qualified enough to receive offers, subtle beliefs may lead employers to still value women's skills and competence less than men's, resulting in lower offers for women. A second reason has to do with how employers perceive the beliefs of other employers. Researchers suggest that cultural beliefs influence not only one's own assessment, but also how one anticipates others will behave. This is a concept known as the third order inference. So during the job search, candidates may be recruited and evaluated by multiple employers. Even if a focal employer does not value the skills and abilities of women and men differently, they might actually anticipate that other employers do. For example, employers may assume that men have better alternative options in the labor markets than women, and consequently, they might make more attractive initial offers to men compared to women. And based on these two reasons, we hypothesize that women on average receive better and lower initial offers than men after accounting for occupations and jobs. Then we ask, why might the gender offer gap? How might the gender offer gap vary across occupations? Um, we expect this to differ across occupations, also for a number of reasons. One is that we think cultural beliefs about what men and women are good at and are suitable for to be different across occupations. We argue that this has to do with the gender stereotypicality of occupations, by which we mean how stereotypically masculine or feminine the tasks are perceived to be within that occupation. We expect the higher offers extend to men and the lower offers extend to women to be more pronounced in masculine typed occupations, where women are viewed as stereotypically lacking the skills and competence. And we focus on the gender stereotypicality of occupations because scholars have long recognized that tasks are gender typed, with some tasks having more masculine characteristics, such as assertiveness, independence, and others having more feminine characteristics, such as caregiving and warmth. And additionally, research suggests that it is important to look beyond gender composition when examining the gender wage gap. So we have some recent studies that have found that cultural beliefs about whether an occupation is masculine or feminine do not perfectly align with its gender composition. A classic example is accounting. Even though now women make up 60% of the accountants in the US, lab studies found that participants still perceived accounting as a masculine typed occupation. There's another study that analyzes 100 billion words from the past 100 years and found that white-collar jobs such as those in finance and accounting still remained culturally masculine typed, despite women entering into these fields in large numbers over the past several decades. So these studies suggest that focusing on gender stereotypicality associated with occupations instead of just gender composition can help us shed more light on how women and men's skills and competence are valued across these occupations. We argue that in masculine type occupations, women may be more likely to have their skills and competence discounted compared to in feminine type occupations because they might be perceived as having the poorest fit with the required tasks. As a result, women's skills may be viewed as less valuable in a masculine typed occupation. On the other hand, previous studies suggest that when there are mismatches for men, that is, when men are hired into stereotypically feminine occupations, the same does not hold. Some have argued that this is because men in feminine typed work settings, such as nursing, may benefit from hidden structural advantages, which might enhance men's career opportunities. And for instance, scholars have found that men in female-dominated jobs are more likely to be evaluated more positively and promoted more quickly. The same has not been shown for women in masculine jobs and occupations. So taken together, we believe that there are differences in the initial offers provided to women and men based on the gender stereotypicality of the tasks within occupations. We predict in our second hypothesis that the initial offer gap is larger in masculine typed occupations than in feminine typed occupations. And to test these hypotheses, we obtained a large-scale proprietary dataset on initial offers from a company called PayScale. PayScale is a compensation platform that has been collecting and providing information about careers and compensation since 2002. It has accumulated more than 55 million salary profiles. So PayScale, here, PayScale collects data through its two kinds of salary surveys. One allows the users to evaluate their current job, and the other one is to evaluate their current job offer. We're focusing here on the survey for offers. Candidates fill out the survey to assess the strength of their offers before deciding whether and how to negotiate with an employer. And at the end of the survey, candidates are given a report showing the range and median offer for a job they're considering. So here is a snapshot of the first page of the salary survey for those evaluating offers. PayScale users are required to provide information of their own offer. They're also incentivized to provide as detailed and accurate information as possible on their own background, as well as the job offers they've received, since doing so could improve the estimation of their own market value. And for the purpose of our study, one empirical concern might be that some offers may have already been negotiated prior to these individuals coming to PayScale and entering their offer information. While this is possible, we believe several aspects of the platform make it quite unlikely. The literature suggests that serious negotiation typically occur only once, and attempts at multiple rounds of negotiation are known to be risky and can signal bad faith. Recent research also suggests that candidates themselves are quite fearful of jeopardizing an offer by negotiating even once, let alone going back to the negotiation table a second time. Even though we cannot claim to have fully removed pre-negotiated offers from our data, we believe that the motivation for candidates going to PayScale to obtain additional information to help them negotiate better largely avoids these offers being pre-negotiated. So here are the variables we collected. In addition to capturing detailed information about their offers, the main body of the PayScale survey also collects demographic information such as age, ethnicity, degree obtained. And the survey also has questions about relevant worker and employer characteristics such as job title, years experience, and location, industry, company size. Our unit of analysis is the offer. Our main analytic sample contains more than 700,000 initial salary offers from 2017 to 2020. We also have a more conservative sample, close to 300,000 offers, which has more granular information on the industry and even anonymized employer ID, which we then use for robustness checks later. So who are these individuals coming to PayScale to assess the strength of their offers? As we can see here, slightly more than half of the sample, 54%, is women, and then close to 60% of the sample has a college degree or above. The average age, the average year of experience is 8.6 years. And when it comes to the differences between women and men in our sample, we don't observe any meaningful differences across these demographic characteristics. What's important to note is that the PayScale sample is not a random nor a representative sample of the US workforce. The analytic sample here has an overrepresentation of women, 54% versus 74% in the US labor force. We think one possible reason is that women have fewer channels, such as social networks, to receive pay information compared to women, so they might be more likely to come to PayScale for that additional information. The analytic sample also has a higher level of education. So 40% has a college degree, whereas approximately 25% of US labor force did in 2017. The analytic sample also skews towards young professionals. More than a third of our analytic sample is aged 24 to 35, whereas 20% of the US labor force is of that age. So overall, the analytic sample skews towards women and white-collar professionals. While this limits the generalizability of our study, we believe that our results are important for this population well represented in our sample, for whom negotiation is crucial and in many jobs common. So the primary dependent variable is the initial salary offer reported on the PayScale platform. Users are asked to provide their annual base salary of their offers. Additionally, they're also asked to provide their expected annual bonus, expected annual profit sharing. Since only 2% of the sample reported that information, they were removed from our main analysis, though we did include them in robustness checks and our results hold. Our main independent variable is gender. And there is a very small proportion of our respondents, 0.2%, who stated that they prefer to self-disclose and leave us a blank when they're asked to clarify what gender they have. So these individuals were not included in the main analysis, given the small sample size. Our other independent variable is gender stereotypicality of occupations. So to measure how masculine or feminine an occupation is perceived to be, we assess the tasks involved in occupations and use natural language processing techniques. We, ob- we obtain task descriptions for every occupation produced and updated by the National Center for the ONET Development. Here is an example of the list of task statements for electrical engineers. We then combine all of these task statements and take all the words from these statements to analyze through word embedding models by computing the cosine similarity between each word in the task description and the masculine feminine vector. So this vector is derived from a pre-trained word embedding model, word2vec, and it represents the directional difference between the semantic spaces of masculine and feminine concepts within an n-dimensional vector space. And the cosine similarity ranges from -1, strongest association with femininity, to 1, which is the strongest association with masculinity, with 0 indicating gender neutrality. So on the right-hand side, we have a stylized sample from another paper using a similar approach that quantifies how masculine or feminine these words are. We use word embedding models to capture how closely the tasks performed within each occupation align with stereotypically masculine or feminine traits. And to obtain an occupational level gender stereotype score, we then aggregate the word level cosine similarities by calculating the median value across all words in the task statements for a given occupation. We also have a rich set of controls that include the years of experience, underrepresented racial minority status, highest education achieved at the time of receiving the offer. We also include the presence of salary history ban as a control, given its policy and the scholarly implications for the gender wage gap. Our fixed effects include occupation, job title, job location, and month. And in the most conservative sample analysis, we also add fixed effects for industry and employers. We define the residual gender gapping in offers as the coefficient beta in the OLS regression with the set of controls we have and the various fixed effects. And robust standard errors are clustered at the level of the job candidate. So now the results. We first turn to hypothesis 1 to examine whether women receive lower initial offers than men. Here we show the kernel density plot of offers by gender. Without taking into consideration any control variables, the average initial offer is 76,000 for men and 59,000 for women. This is a difference that's statistically significant. We then turn to multivariate models. Here is the regression result reporting the effect of being female on initial salary offers. The coefficient of being female remains negative and statistically significant at the 0.01 level in all models. So in model 1, the marginal effect is 0.24 without including any controls and fixed effects. It means that women make the gender wage gap, the gender gapping offers is 24%. In model 2, with the inclusion of human capital controls, the marginal effect reduces to minus 0.22. And in model 3, with the inclusion and occupation of the job fixed effects, the marginal effect of being female on job offers goes down significantly than to 7%. In model 4, with the inclusion of job location, month fixed effects, the marginal effect stays the same. And in model 5, as you can see, it has a small number of observations than the previous models. This is our most conservative sample with the inclusion of industry and employer fixed effects. And we have a 5.5% percent gap in offers between men and women. And this is the gender gapping offers for those with the same job title within the same occupation industry and even within the same employer. So we conclude that hypothesis one is supported. Additionally, we also find that the gender offer gap is not localized to any specific sector, just like the gender wage gap, but widespread and across all occupations. Now we turn to hypothesis two to examine how the size of the gender offer gap might correspond with the gender stereotypicality of occupations. We start by assessing the relationship descriptively. We find a positive correlation that is statistically significant at the 0.05 level between gender stereotypicality of occupations on the x-axis and the residual gender offer gap on the y-axis, as shown here in this plot. The residual gender offer gap is the gap that remains after accounting for all observable differences we have in our data. And turning to multivariate models, we include the gender composition of each of the occupations as a control variable by using the proportion of women by occupation as reported by the US Census Bureau. So in model one, we regress the residual gender offer gap onto the masculinity score, and we find a positive relationship between the two. In model two, we regress the gender offer gap onto the proportion of women in each occupation, and we have a negative relationship, which means that as the proportion of women in the occupation increases, the gender offer gap decreases. In model three, once the proportion of women is also included as a control, the relationship between the masculinity of an occupation and the gender offer gap remains positive, but is no longer significant at the 0.05 level. However, if we use a one-sided hypothesis test, given that our hypothesis two is one-sided, we find a statistically significant relationship, still positive relationship between masculinity and the gender offer gap. So overall, our results are directional and suggest a positive relationship between the gender typing of occupations and the gender offer gap, whereby women may receive lower offers than men in occupations with more masculine typed tasks. So after examining both hypotheses, we now subject our results to a number of robustness checks. So first, we want to assess the reliability and data quality of the pay scale platform. We do so by examining if the gender offer gap correlates with the gender wage gap. We expect offers to correspond to wages, given that offers act as a baseline for starting salaries and subsequent wages. And if not, this will raise concerns about the offers on this platform and whether they're informative for understanding the gender wage gap. Given that we only have offer data, we use data on wages from the 2019 American Community Survey, which reports data on the median earnings of full-time, year-round workers by occupation. And to more easily visualize this relationship, we plot this comparison, collapsing all occupations to 22 major occupation groups. Each data point here represents the gender wage gap on the x-axis and the gender offer gap on the y-axis for a given major occupation group. And the relationship here is positively correlated and statistically significant. The average unadjusted gender wage gap is 20.68% across all major occupation groups, while the average offer gap was 14.15%. This suggests that the pay scale platform provides reliable offer data, and offers may significantly contribute to explaining the observed gender wage gap. Another potential concern is the observational nature of the study. There are inevitably unobserved characteristics that are unaccounted for in our model. We acknowledge this limitation, and as a step to address it, we first benchmark our empirical strategies and results against prior studies of the gender wage gap, as presented in this table here. The gender gaps we find in offers fall within similar ranges to those reported for the gender wage gap. And to further address unobserved heterogeneity, we also conducted analysis focusing on highly similar job candidates. Specifically, we examined college graduates entering the labor market because their skills and training are likely to be most comparable. So even when we restrict our sample to the subset of graduates with identical years of work experience, a residual gender gap still persisted. We observed a 1.1% residual gender gap for graduates with no work experience and a 3.7% gap for those with 1 to 5 years of experience. And finally, we also consider if our results are sensitive to using a specific measure of compensation. As mentioned previously, our measure of the initial salary offer combines the annual base salary with expected bonuses and profit sharing, and approximately 2% of our sample reported expected bonuses and profits. So here, if we remove those who reported additional compensation data, but using only the base salary, we find the same results. And for the small sample of bonus and profit sharing information, a gender gap also exists. So to summarize, in this research, we examine initial salary offers as a potential overlooked juncture that gives rise to gender inequality in compensation in labor markets. We found robust evidence of a gender offer gap of 5.5% for US sample of job candidates after controlling for occupations, industries, job titles, and employers. We also find evidence that the gender offer gap is higher in masculine typed occupations than in feminine typed occupations. And a residual gender offer gap exists even among the early careers, which suggests that it does not get explained away by experience. And finally, we find a positive and statistically significant relationship between the raw gender wage gap and the raw gender wage gap across occupations, which suggests that offers may play a substantial role in explaining the observed gender wage gap. And this study, while the study has limitations because it's an observational study, and we also don't observe, offer and pay information for the same individuals, and we do not have data on their negotiation outcome. And these could be areas that we can pursue for future research. Nevertheless, our study still makes important contributions to the literature on organizations and labor markets. And so despite many studies of the gender wage gap, this is the very first study on offers. And we believe that this is also the first study of offers in a real world setting outside labs, for example. And what we find suggests that employers contribute to the gender wage gap by providing imbalanced offers across candidates. And this is important to note because the prior studies have long recognized that both supply side, demand side contributions to gender inequality, but it's particularly difficult to untackle the demand side contributions because it's difficult to observe what employers provide and what goes on in a real world setting. And scholars have also long acknowledged the importance of starting salaries because this may set up negotiation outcomes. And our study is the first out there to show that, maybe what we have assumed in the past that people's starting offers may look the same, but it's their negotiation behavior that may differ and drive the gender wage gap. This might not be the case because here we found that the offers that men and women receive are different across industries, occupations, jobs, even within the same employer. So hopefully this can suggest that we should be looking more at what happens as first offers are extended to job candidates in the hiring process. And this may not be purely attributed to candidates' negotiation behavior. And so with that, thank you so much for being here. We would love to hear your questions and feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shia, for that terrific presentation. And thank you again to all of you for joining. We have a couple of excellent questions already submitted through the Q&A function, but if there's anything on your mind, please do use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your question. So, she, I'd like to start with a question from Tammy, which is, are you able to comment on whether the employers in your study are consciously extending lower offers to women? In other words, are they exploiting what we know about the gender pay gap going in favor of men and in disfavor of women?
hmm so I think in our study, of course, it's really hard to observe what the employers are thinking about and are doing, though we do have information on for a subset of our candidates on whether or not the employers know what the candidates are making prior to this new job. So they could be using the information on someone's salary history to set offers, and consciously making someone a lower offer because they know that this person has less leverage in this context. So this. I actually have a different paper trying to answer this question, but it's not one of our main interests in this paper.
Thank you. And dovetailing directly on from that, we have a couple of questions about the new pay transparency laws that have been introduced around the world and also in the United States in several states. So, can
Right.
you comment on the impact of these laws in relation to your work?
So there actually have been a lot of studies on the salary history ban. That is actually one of my papers also looking at this specific question and looking at what happens to the offers that employers extend. And I would say that the results are mixed. Um, and partly because people have looked at information on wages. So we know that when someone gets an offer, gets negotiated, and then when someone reports a wage later on during their tenure, it's really hard to understand the cause and effect because so many things could have happened in that meantime. But it's also really hard to study this question in a lab setting because people don't have real incentives and real constraints in those settings to determine what offers to extend and how to negotiate. So I would say that this is a really challenging question, but I think for some people, especially for women or for maybe racial minorities who have been making less in the past, by providing that information could anchor employers, future employers, when they're extending them new offers, because you're making your leverage known to other people, and this could hurt your chances.
Thank you. There's another interesting question related to this, which is, can your study shed any light on whether employers are openly acknowledging or aware of the fact that they're making lower offers to women, or is it unconscious, or is it perhaps conscious, but they're trying to actively hide this? So, do we know
Yeah.
anything about kind of whether employers are intentional about this?
I would say it's very hard to know. We don't know that in the study at all because we don't have the data. Uh, and I think it's really hard to ask someone this question too because there's social desirability bias. When you're asked, maybe you're more likely to want to appear, good and conscientious in some ways. So this could be an assumption, but I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Absolutely. Here's another one that several people are interested in is, can you offer any insight on how these dynamics might play out in other geographies, Global South, Asia, Middle East, Japan? Either do you know anything through your own work, or do you have a hypothesis in terms of whether you might see similar effects in some of these other locations?
hmm this is a fascinating question. I think cultural beliefs, as we mentioned here, is so deeply rooted in the culture. And I think in the Western societies, when we have this clear hierarchy, men are viewed as more competent in some work settings. This could affect offers and wages. Um, and I think this could be also the case in Asia, for example, when there is, gender inequality in many aspects of business organizations. But what's different is that in some settings where there is a very strict, for example, in government jobs, you have very strict levels and people have very narrow pay grade. And then I think it's hard to really be able to negotiate or extend offers are widely different between men and women. So I think it is driven by culture. It's also driven by kind of the hierarchies and the bureaucracy in organizations in settings. So while, for example, in Asia, we might also experience gender kind of inequality in terms of cultural beliefs, but if the jobs are structured in a way that with very narrow pay band, we might not be able to observe much of that compared to Western societies.
Thank you. And speaking of narrow pay bands, were any of the employers in the study unionized? Is that something that you were able to examine? And there's also just a question about how many employers were part of the study.
Yes. So let me see how many employers are. In this study, we have anonymized employer ID, and we have more than, I think, close to 2,000 employers represented in this study. I would say that for our study, most of the employers are in the private sector. Of course, there is a huge difference between those in the public sector, government jobs, versus the private sector in terms of the pay band levels, how much they can offer, how much they can go over the pay band, for example. So for our study, majority of them I would say, are in the private sector, so I can't comment on, government jobs. We have a very small sample of the government jobs that are actually removed from the sample, but that would be something interesting kind of to study for future research.
Yeah. And the reason I mentioned, that in relation to narrow pay gaps is because past work has found that, in fact, in unionized settings where pay scales are much more formalized and consistent, there's much less managerial discretion. We actually find that pay gaps by gender and race are smaller than they are in non-unionized workplaces. But yes, definitely an area for further research. Let's go back to talking about some of those domains like HEAL, health, education, administration, and literacy occupations, where men are behind. Pardon me. Yes, exactly. Where men are behind compared to women. So those are sort of female-dominated occupations.
Mhm.
Anna has a question where she says, "I know that men are represented in these occupations. I thought the implication of that is that men are on the losing end of HEAL when it comes to those pay in those occupations, just like women are on the losing end in STEM occupations, for example, which are otherwise male dominated. But it sounds like you found that despite being underrepresented, even in those field occupations, men actually benefit as far as compensation and advancement. So
Mhm.
is gender inequality a two-way street, or do men somehow seem to win no matter where they work?"
I think maybe it's the former. I think men seem to win no matter where they are. The studies I quoted in this paper is actually prior studies have found that men in these heel occupations actually are more likely to be promoted as, the manager, and they're evaluated more positively, like the male teacher, elementary school teacher, the male nurse, and then they eventually kind of rise through the ranks faster. And so then they very quickly not become kind of, they enter a pay grade of a different level. Um, and in our data, what we found is that men don't seem to suffer the same way, be penalized the same way that women are in a mismatched occupation. So I think this might be, also a numbers game because I think fewer men are in feminized occupations. Then now a lot of women are entering into these white collar jobs, knowledge sectors. Like I said here in our study, in other study that found in accounting and finance, actually we have a lot of women entering those occupations, but we still see very bleak gender gaps.
Yes, thank you. Let's talk about intersectionality for a moment. For example, the intersection between gender and age. Do you have any data on that or any other intersectional dimensions? So, for example, would an older man be more likely to be offered a higher salary than an older woman, or a young and old comparison?
Yes. So what we have is we don't have longitudinal data on that, but we did have to do analysis looking at the gender gap for different years of experience. And we see that that gap is larger for the people in our sample that are on the older end. And we think that this could be a number of reasons. One is that we do expect to see path dependency in wages over time. So what we also know, I think, from prior studies that if women don't negotiate at all, they could lose out on over, close to $1 million in pay throughout their entire career, just because that initial difference can get amplified and compounded every single time you switch job, every single time you have an opportunity to negotiate. And so we think that this could definitely drive the widening gender gap in wages in offers over time. But also in our data, because it's not following the same individual over the course of their entire careers. It is looking at the data as a snapshot. So there could be cohort effect, generational effect. Maybe the people, older people in our data set coming from an era where they had fewer educational opportunities and they were not able to, they followed very different career trajectories because STEM maybe wasn't emphasized back then, and women are entering into occupations that have lower pay, or that women are opting out from that generation. So it'd be really interesting to actually be able to follow maybe the millennial generation over time, and maybe 40, 50 years from now to look at, does that intersectionality play out over their career?
Mm. And a quick follow-up, do we have any specific information about the intersectionality between gender and race or gender and ethnicity?
So our data, the race information is very noisy. We have racial minority, but it's not. It could definitely be something very important to study, but we don't have the kind of data quality we will have liked to answer those questions.
Thank you. What's your sense and the data? Is the gender pay gap narrowing or widening? And do we have any understanding of how the recent diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, either at the company level, like in the US, or if you're aware, even at governmental levels around the world, in terms of requirement of pay gap reporting or gender quotas on corporate boards, these types of initiatives, have they had any measurable effect on the gender pay gap?
hmm That's a really good question. I think just the overall trend of the gender wage gap. Um, It's really hard to get the pulse on that, though I think there has been new trends of transparency. I think that could definitely help close the gap. Just like pay scale, there are lots of different platforms like Levels FYI, Glassdoor, Blind. I think there's just so many platforms out there where people are more likely to share information about pay and career and promotion. So I think when we have the more information out there we have about these very opaque processes that could be biased maybe in the past behind doors. Now with that information and with more advocacy, I think people are more likely to ask for what they deserve. And so hopefully this could be a positive trend for us to make sure people are getting, a fair pay and are getting fair worth.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that white collar and corporate jobs were kind of dominant in the sample. Did you
Mhm.
find anything about other types of work settings, such as manufacturing jobs or other blue collar um, roles that you might be able to share with us?
Yes. So as I said, our data really skews towards the younger kind of white collar professionals. We have uh, yes, we have data on other occupations, but what I noticed is that for other occupations, maybe the variance pay is also lower, meaning that in construction, maybe you won't see someone like in finance, a few years into their careers making upward, half a million or a million. I think the potential for pay increases is a lot larger over the course of careers for white collar professionals. And that makes it all the more important for negotiation and for, offers to matter because it can really have an outsized impact on your long-term career earnings. And I'm guessing that it could be the case for other jobs too, but the magnitude of which we see kind of those increases have on their lifetime pay might be less.
Mm. On that note, is there any data on job hopping where people actually switch jobs and switch organizations in order to attain kind of a meaningful increase on their pay? Do we
Mm-hmm.
know if the extent to which this is a phenomenon, and do we know if it's actually working for women or men?
Yes, absolutely. Um, I know there is a paper by a colleague who actually is looking at whether or not job hopping can lead to higher pay increases than internal promotions within the same organization, and that is indeed the result. And that's why a lot of people are switching jobs once every 2 or 3 years. To obtain that pay increase. Or you can also see it a way as to escape pay discrimination, right? If you don't think you're being paid fairly, if you go to the labor market, go to the market again and getting matched and find someone who value your skills and competence more, you can actually have a reset. So it can be both positive and negative. People can use it to their advantage. Others can also use it to fix their situation. Though I would say that while job hopping does seem to lead to a pay increase, um, it it actually affects men and women differently, just because for men, maybe they have more geographic flexibility. They could, take a job maybe that requires more commute time, or actually consider moving to a different city, right? If you're the wife in the family, you're trying to maximize household income, maybe you're more likely to be, able to make more willing to make that move, even though it doesn't make much sense for your own career, but your husband's career. So who job hops? I think it's probably gendered, though job hopping does lead to kind of meaningful pay increases.
That's an important distinction. Thank you. In the last few moments of our Q&A, I'd like to center on the many, many questions that we have about the practical applications and what all of us here today might actually do with this incredibly valuable information that you've shared with us, Shia. So let's start with the question of, if I were to take this back to my organization, and if I were to summarize the core findings and sort of what are the actionable insights from your research, what are your 3 to 5 talking points that you would like to leave with our listeners and our attendees today?
hmm So I would say that hiring is very important for the gender wage gap. And so for organizations, if you want to have equal pay, you need to start much earlier, kind of in the hiring process, rather than to say, okay, we need to fix pay later on in the organization. I think that's much harder to do. So when you're initially hiring people, maybe it's useful to be able to have set very clear expectations for what the role would require and how much you're willing to pay. Because a lot of times in these hiring conversations, when someone has attended an offer and when negotiation happens, exceptions can be made. And then all of a sudden an offer gets negotiated above the pay grade and assigned to a different business family. And so a lot of things can happen, but if you really want to stick to, giving men and women fair pay, I think that expectation needs to be placed kind of earlier on. Um, and for, and I think with this study too, it also shows that at the point of hire, very little information can be actually gleaned from the job interviews. So what might be really helpful is to, have more regular kind of reviews, evaluations about someone's performance and being able to adjust that later on. So rather than having, making offers and making allowing for maybe negotiation, letting that drive the pay increases, having more check-ins and more, promotional opportunities and performance evaluations, pay raise opportunities. I think that could perhaps motivate the employees more and making sure that everyone is getting paid fairly.
And how do you feel about policies like where you set a single pay for a particular role or a particular rank, and you say, we're a law
Uh-huh.
firm and all of our intern associates get exactly the same amount. Or if
Yeah.
we're a manufacturing firm and if you're at the rank of manager, everyone's going to get exactly the same amount.
Mhm.
What effects might those types of policies have?
Yeah, I think that is very ideal, and I think it's probably harder to implement in practice. Just because sometimes organizations maybe hire, they have a little leeway in terms of their head count, and then when they see talent, they really want someone to work for the organization, even though they don't specifically have, a job that's in mind for someone. So I think that makes it difficult to plan. And also, I think another challenge is assessment. How do you assess someone's, experience and skills and competence at the point of hire to know exactly what kind of person you need for that role and what that person might be able to do? I think, anecdotally, people have discovered kind of in the hiring process, maybe this person could be better fitted for a different role and for a different level. So I think while this is, would be wonderful kind of to implement in theory, in practice, maybe it's a lot more messy than we think.
Hmm. How about the concept of anonymization? So just like with resumes, you can evaluate resumes without the person's name at the top, or with the educational institutions and the
Yes.
names of past employers anonymized. Is some kind of anonymous review of pay possible? Is there a way that this concept of anonymization could be brought into the realm of offers and pay setting?
Oh, that's very interesting. So I guess that could be implemented if, for example, in the hiring process, you actually separate the offer process from the evaluation, right? If you have, the hiring manager and plus however many, managers assessing this candidate, and once this candidate is deemed as qualified for a job, then it's passed to someone else who hasn't really seen the candidate to kind of, handle the offer process, and then to say that if you have met those criteria, this is the offer. And that's very similar, I think, to what you suggested earlier about being very deliberate and intentional about what that offer is, rather than leaving a really wide pay grade, a pay range for for negotiation and for other exceptions to be made. But I think at the same time, this is hard to do partly because companies don't want to lose talent, right? If you're the only person implementing this policy, um, you could very easily lose someone who has a better offer somewhere else or is able to negotiate a higher offer. And so, what's your talent strategy? What is what segment of the talent market are you trying to attract? Are you trying to attract the top 10? Then do you have to actually make offers that's within the top 10%? um, of the market. And so I think it's really hard to balance for organizations to think about, how do we make pay that's fair, but how do we also attract talent and not lose it to our competitors? And I think it could be something that would be done if all organizations, all companies in the world are setting pay, to the same standards, and we're only making one pay, for this level. Otherwise, I think it's really hard to be the only person doing it.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so very much, Shia, and Anisha, over to you to close us out.
Thank you both so much. Um, Thank you so much, Shia, for sharing your really important research with us, and thank you, Siri, for leading us through that really insightful Q&A. Please join us all next week for our next WAPP seminar. We have Ricardo Perez Trujillo, who is the economics professor at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, and will present his research on a very relevant topic that you were talking about today, Shia, on pay transparency, salary negotiations, and the gender pay gap. So we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you next week. And thank you again, Shia and Siri, for leading us through the conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me.